I can also have hardness of heart toward my spouse. Sometimes a spouse can grow a hard heart toward their spouse. And what Jesus is telling us here is anytime there's conflict in a marriage, conflict is the result of a hard heart. Either both the husband and wife have hard hearts toward God and His Word and what God commands us, or a hard heart towards each other, or one member of the marriage has a hard heart towards the Lord and the spouse and the Lord's way. And so he says here the ideal, the way He designed it was for us to stay in our marriage for life, but God permits divorce because our hearts are hard. But He doesn't permit divorce for just any reason at all. Remember, that was the question the Pharisees originally asked that started this whole thing. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Well, it's not just for any reason. Look at verse 9. Jesus, weighs in on this debate now. And He says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So, the original design, stay in the marriage for life, except when there is sexual immorality. That would be the one exception. When there's sexual immorality. If there's sexual immorality in a marriage, then the innocent party in the marriage is permitted to divorce and remarry. Again, I say permit it, not command it. There are many couples that stay together and work through the healing from sexual immorality in the marriage. Now, what is sexual immorality? This word that he uses here, it's a very broad word. It's not a narrow word, it's a broad word. And this word that Jesus uses here, it refers to all kinds of sexual sin. It's not just the act of adultery or the physical act of adultery. It includes a much wider definition of sexual sin. If you're taking notes, the Greek word is porneia, from which we get the word pornography, for example. So looking at pornography often is within this definition of sexual immorality. And sometimes people will attempt to justify their sexual immorality by saying, well, I never did anything physical, just watching videos. And Jesus intentionally uses a very broad word here to include all sexual sin. And the reason divorce is permitted in the case of sexual immorality is because the spouse who is committing sexual immorality is joining himself or herself to someone else. They're becoming one flesh with another person, even if it's just a video on YouTube. And that can damage the marriage beyond repair. And so divorce is permitted in the case of sexual immorality. And there's one other circumstance when divorce is permissible for a Christian, if you want to jot this verse down. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15 says, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you're married to an unbeliever and your unbelieving spouse wants to depart from the marriage and divorce, you don't push them out, but they don't want to remain married to you. They choose to leave the marriage. Well, then it says you're free from the marriage and free to remarry a believer. And those are the only two biblical reasons for a Christian to divorce. And with these two reasons, a person is free to divorce and remarry. Now, incompatibility is not grounds for a divorce for a Christian. Growing apart is not grounds for divorce. Falling out of love, not loving each other anymore, that's not grounds. Unhappiness is not grounds for divorce. Only when there is sexual immorality is divorce permitted but not commanded, and when an unbelieving spouse departs the marriage. That really, really limits the reasons for divorce. And that limitation hopefully causes people to enter into marriage carefully, because they are entering into the marriage covenant for the rest of their lives. And that limitation, essentially takes divorce off the table. Just like Adam and Eve didn't have any other choices. There weren't other men around or other girls around. And so that should cause people to work on the marriage and work through the difficulties and work toward peace in the marriage, because you're in it for life. And you need to go into your marriage with the mindset of, I'm in it for life. There are no other men or women. Just like Adam and Eve, there's no escape hatch here. And so I need to stay in this thing, and I need to do the hard work of making this marriage a peaceful, joy-filled marriage that glorifies God. Because if I'm in it for life, I don't want to be miserable for the next 40 years. I don't want to be miserable in my life. And so many couples, they just choose to live miserably. And then 20, 30, 40 years goes by. I want to make the best of this. I want it to be as joyful and life-giving and a refuge for me as I can. Because I got no other place to go. Now, another passage of Scripture that is relevant to this study is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 11. 1 Corinthians 7:11 also permits Christians to separate in their marriage when divorce is not allowed. When they haven't, there's no sexual immorality involved, and so they don't have grounds for a biblical divorce. 1 Corinthians 7:11 says that they can separate, and they're still married to each other during that time of separation, and so they lived as married people, though they're separated. And sometimes this is necessary if there's some kind of volatility in the home or something toxic in the home, or maybe the couple needs to just separate so that they can have cooler heads to really work through whatever their issues are. But it's not, they don't really have grounds for divorce, but maybe it's unsafe for them to stay together in the home. And so separation to try to work through and reconcile what's going on. Now look at verse 9 again. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Jesus speaks with authority here, and we see that throughout the Gospels. He's always saying things like, I say to you, right? Very definitive here. People didn't speak that way when they were talking about Scripture. They were talking about God and what God commands. You know, they would even say, Moses said, right? Or the rabbis teach, or Rabbi so-and-so says. Jesus speaks with authority,